to intervene and also report to the agency that bad behavior. Chief Davis.
Thank you, Congresswoman, and I agree with you 100%. That is why one of the things I asked for earlier was the reaffirmation of the oath of office, because the officer takes the oath to the Constitution to protect and serve, and they have a duty to serve. And we say against all enemies, foreign and domestic. They have the duty to take the calls that they're sent to. They have the duties to enforce the law, and most policies require the duty to intervene. And so they were morally obligated, they were procedurally obligated, they were legally obligated to intervene with Mr. Floyd's murder. They're legally obligated to respond to the calls. We expect them to go to active shooters. We expect them to go to bank robberies, domestic violence, and we also expect them to be consistent. And so anyone that's violating the law should be held accountable, and is not a pass because you wear the badge. So as you know, as a chief, as I just spent 9 years as a chief, it should be held to a much higher standard, and that standard includes the duty to intervene, duty to report misconduct, the duty to render first aid, because those are the high standards of this profession.
Thank you so much, Chief Davis, and Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Armstrong.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not sure that a at-large representative from a state that is 89% white and 100% rural is always the best person to address these issues, and I don't pretend to be. But we neighbor Minnesota. Minneapolis is a city that is far and away the closest to North Dakotans' hearts. And on May 25th, we watched in abject horror as your brother was brutally murdered. And on May 27th, our entire state mourned because Officer Cody Holte was killed trying to save another officer who had been wounded, independent of anything else that is going on in the rest of the country. And the very next Tuesday, we buried Officer Cody Holte, and it was an incredibly beautiful and incredibly tragic funeral. Yesterday, I watched your brother's funeral, and it was incredibly beautiful and incredibly tragic. But you know what I found through the whole course of all of this? None of it was binary. I agree with Congresswoman Demings. This is not enough us against them. This is not that situation. We can do reform. We've done it before. We've done it in states like North Dakota. And I hope when we go through a markup that we are willing to work through this, because I think you'll find there are a lot of people on my side of the aisle that agree with a lot of the concepts on the other side of the aisle. But I will view this bill the same way I view every other bill. How does it work at 2:30 on the side of the road in a state where where it's often one officer, and by the way, not just for the officer and the person being detained, but how does it work at 2:30 on the side of a road where backup is measured in hours and not minutes? Because my concern with these things is always, I don't pretend to know how to police in urban districts. I don't live in an urban district. But you have to recognize that as we intend to do these things, we have a high turnover rate. We have a hard time hiring law enforcement as it is in North Dakota. We have to make sure that it can work everywhere. But if it comes to holding bad cops accountable and bad departments accountable, I'm all in. Because once they wash out everywhere else, they might end up where I'm at. And we don't want that either. But after that, I think I would go with, I hope I can give some people some hope. Because regardless of how this works next week, and regardless of what we mark up, what we move forward, we shouldn't be done. We should continue to work towards other things. And those things are disparities in sentencing, disparities in pretrial release, things that we quantifiably can show exist. In 2016, and this is primarily in state court because it's about 88% of the prison population in the United States is in state court. Black prisoners serve essentially a 5-to-1 prison sentence on drug crimes than white prisoners. Now that's down from 16-to-1 in 2000, but it's pretty hard to pat yourself on the back for something that shouldn't exist in the first place. And what we found is that as we move forward, and we dealt with minimum mandatory sentencing, and minimum mandatory sentencing was supposed to be to get rid of disparity in these sentences. But what we found is blacks are almost twice as likely to be charged with a minimum mandatory offense as white. So instead of taking it out of the court's hands and the judge's hands, we've moved it into prosecutors' hands. Pretrial release, as we continue to do this, states have done this. North Dakota has done this. Working towards issues that allow for people to be released based on risk assessment, not monetary value. Those types of things work. And this matters on the street because you know if you're going to get arrested that you're not going to get out. The likelihood of you resisting, absconding, all of those different things goes up significantly. We can do that. We should look at policies that are racially neutral on their face, but have a historically disparate racial impact. School zone enhancement for drug crimes. As we've seen this go on years after years, these enhancements have gotten larger and larger, and they also tend to be in highly urban, densely populated, poor neighborhoods that are predominantly African American. Those enhancements need reform. We need to look at those things. And those are things we can continue to do, and I will continue to do with everybody on the other side of the aisle. And my point to this is not to deflect. We've heard all of these different things today. But I want my friends on the other side of the aisle to know that we can do this. And I know we can do it because we did it in North Dakota. And if we can do it in North Dakota, we can do it absolutely anywhere. But it takes working with each other, and it takes working with each other on both sides of the aisle. So no matter how we move forward on this and continue to work, I want you all to know there are people on our side of the aisle that are committed to working on these issues that will have real positive impact for people all across this country. And it's not just about what we have going on now, it's how we continue to work in the future. So reach out, ask us, we're here to help. Thank you all.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler and Chairwoman Bass, for holding this most important hearing. And Mr. Floyd, I want to thank you for being here today in this very difficult moment for you and your family. The murder of your brother, George Floyd, reminds us all that the relationship between public safety and those who they are sworn to protect can't be assumed to always be one that's a healthy relationship. In my district, the new Ellis Island of the United States, we're diverse and we're always changing. New Americans live side by side with the greatest generation. We have to remember that we are not a police state and we are not a police country, and that for public safety officers to do their job, trust and cooperation are essential. We've worked really hard over decades, the last few decades, to bring that trust into being. And that's why it is so sad to see again another murder, another tragedy in our streets. And this is exactly why this bill has to become law. When I was a California legislator, this issue kept popping up over and over again. In my work with the autism community, this issue again resurfaced about a decade ago. As police began to confront the tidal wave of maturing autistic children, we soon realized that police officers were not trained to deal with autistic adults. Autistic individuals not capable of following directions were considered to be uncooperative, and soon violent confrontations arose and were reported in the press. My work in this area in updating California police officer standards was soon brought to the attention of a retired police chief in the Midwest, the father of an autistic adult who was also trying to address the issue of autism in public safety. This clearly shows that police training is not a local issue, but a national issue. And again, this shows why this bill must become law. The Justice Policing Act of 2020 improves police training and practices by creating law enforcement development programs to develop policies, best practices, among others. In my legislation, H.R. 5251, Improving Community Safety Task Force, directs the Attorney General to also establish a task force seeking ways to reduce violent clashes between communities and public safety officers. And Mr. Chairman, at this point, I'd like to submit for the record a letter from Brian Marvel, President of the Peace Officers Research Association of California, discussing how they support reforms.
Without objection.
And Mayor Underwood, I want to let you know that your family's loss, your brother, will also not go forgotten. I have a question for Professor Butler. Welcome, first of all, sir, and welcome to all the witnesses.
Thank you, sir.
I'd like to take a moment to discuss arrest disparities. The ACLU has said African Americans are almost 4 times more likely to be arrested for cannabis possession. For Washington, D.C., you have stated that African Americans are about 50% of those that use cannabis, yet they account for 90% of the people who are charged with marijuana crimes. Is that correct, sir?
Yes, sir.
How do you think the legalization of cannabis will help with social justice in this nation?
We think it would help create equal justice under the law. We know that for drug crimes, African Americans don't disproportionately commit those crimes. National Institute of Health says that we don't disproportionately possess drugs. Most people report buying drugs from someone of their own race. If you go from NIH and Bethesda to the Bureau of Justice Statistics in D.C., they'll tell you 60% people locked up for drug crimes are black. About 15% of people who do the crime, 60% of people who do the time. That's unequal justice under the law.
So would you?
Law issue.
Thank you very much, and Mr. Chair, I yield.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Scanlon.
Thank you. First, of course, I want to join my colleagues in expressing our condolences to your family, Mr. Floyd. I cannot begin to imagine the pain of having to relive that video over and over again. I just want to thank you for having the strength to speak here today, to share George's story and his spirits and his words with this committee, but also with the country. And I'm sure that your brother would be proud of you. Our hearts and those of every thinking and feeling American are with you and your family, and we're committed to making the changes that we need to ensure that you, your family, and every family in this country receives the equal justice and the security that our Constitution and our most essential American values demand. We're here to listen and to confront the harsh truths about racism in our country and the law enforcement practices that for too long have allowed police violence against communities of color and especially Black individuals. The murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, and on have once again brought these truths to the surface, that centuries of systemic racism and inaction have resulted in a justice system that harms Black communities and policing practices that disproportionately kill Black Americans. This is unacceptable. We must change. America must change. And Americans have taken to the streets in peaceful protest all across this great nation, in big cities and small towns, to demand that change. We are witnessing a long overdue moral reckoning in our country, and each of us must examine how to be agents of that change, because we have a lot of work to do. Change must come at the local, state, and federal level, just as cities and states are reckoning with ways to protect communities and hold law enforcement accountable. Congress must do the same. I want to thank all our witnesses for helping us understand the changes we need to make to achieve justice for all Americans, particularly which ones are uniquely crying out for federal solutions. Having worked for decades as a public interest lawyer, I'm particularly interested in some of the legal fixes that this bill provides. I know that sometimes small changes in a statute can have enormous implications for holding powerful institutions accountable, and the bill we're considering contains a few of those. Ms. Gupta, one of the ways that police officers can be held accountable is a federal law that makes it a crime to violate someone's civil rights, including by using excessive force as a police officer. But in its current form, it's very difficult to get a conviction under that law because it requires proving that the police officer willfully violated a person's civil rights. Can you explain how changing the statute to require a reckless standard instead of willfulness would improve police accountability?
Yeah, so the Justice Department currently only has one law that they can use to prosecute police misconduct. And as you said, it has the highest mens rea requirement there is in criminal law, requiring not only that prosecutors prove that the officer used unreasonable force, but actually also that the officer knew that what he or she was doing was in violation of the law and did it anyway. That is actually a very high burden. And so for years, there have been case after case that the Justice Department has been unable to reach because of how high this burden is. There are many criminal civil rights prosecutors that for years have also wanted the change that is being proposed in the Justice and Policing Act, because I think it would enhance the Justice Department's credibility in these matters to be able to hold officers who violate federal civil rights laws accountable. And so the Justice and Policing Act asks it change the mens rea standard to knowingly or with reckless disregard. It's a slightly lower standard, so more cases will be charged. It also really importantly broadens the language of the federal civil rights statute by including in its definition of a death resulting from an officer's action any act that was a substantial factor contributing to death. And I know many, many former U.S. attorneys that are eager to see this change as well.
I actually was approached by one of those former U.S. attorneys at my train station this week, saying
go.
this was probably one of the key provisions. It looks like the time has expired, so I yield back. Thank you.
The gentlelady yields back. Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all the witnesses. I thank you for your patience. I know it's been a long day, but certainly the topic is worthy of that time and probably more times of discussion before we ultimately vote. To Mr. Floyd and Ms. Underwood Jacobs, we certainly accompanying your grief. I know you and I visited just a little bit at the funeral yesterday in Houston. Please know that you have my heartfelt condolences. You know, I have 5 brothers. You know, sometimes they beat up on me a little bit, and sometimes they were helpful, and sometimes they were just brothers. So I know how important that is, so I grieve with you. Mr. Chairman, I wish that we were here today under different circumstances. Instead, we're here because our nation is struggling to heal after witnessing the horrific murder of George Floyd. As a person of faith, I was taught at an early age that we are all children of God. George Floyd was not treated as a child of God during his final moments on this earth. Mr. Floyd, I stand with you and your family, and I stand with Black and brown Americans and all Americans across the country who just want to live and breathe without fear. I stand with my colleagues in the Congressional Black Caucus as we demand for America to live up to its values. We can no longer continue living in America that says during the Pledge of Allegiance, justice for all, but then not actually guarantee justice for all. We must put an end to police brutality, racial profiling, white supremacy, and racism in America. We are here today because our laws must boldly affirm that Black lives matter. I want to get to the topic of the case itself, the investigation, and what may or may not happen, because I think that the Justice and Policing Act addresses a lot of the issues that I've seen as a lawyer, a former judge, when some of these cases are handled. I also might add that I served as the first chair of the Police Independent Oversight Board in Houston. I helped Mayor Parker put that together, then she made me chair for 2 years. So I've seen some of these cases, and some of them are tough to make. And in your case, Mr. Floyd, I think that it was good that there was swift action. The police officer was arrested. It took a little time before they arrested the others. But in many cases, the Arbery case, he was out jogging 74 days before an arrest. And just recently we saw in the video that was just released in Williamson County, an incident that happened in March of 2019. The arrest was actually delayed, and the video was even more delayed They just released it last week, although it happened in March of 2019, a year later. So sometimes it's not quick enough, and then we wonder why. So I wanted to ask first Ms. Eiffel, if she's still on us with us by video. In terms of investigations, are we adequately addressing the need for an independent investigation in the Justice and Policing Act?
Yes, this is one of the most important parts of the legislation. It is critical that communities feel that these killings and these abuses are investigated by someone who is independent, who is not connected with the local prosecutor's office, and who can bring fresh eyes to bear on whether there was a violation of the Constitution or a violation of criminal law. And in too many places around the country, we have seen these incidents where prosecutors have demonstrated that they are unwilling to robustly lean into an investigation, unwilling to arrest, unwilling to indict, or if they bring the case before the grand jury, we then hear later that the presentation was lackluster and was not the kind of presentation we would expect of a prosecutor. So
Well,
we
thank
need
you.
independence.
I want to
This is
move quickly
there is
if we can.
a colossal lack of confidence right now in the justice system, and it is deserved. And as a lawyer, I can say it pains me because I have dedicated my life as a civil rights lawyer to using the law to effect change. But what you are seeing on the streets of this country, all over this country, is a colossal lack of confidence in the justice system. And it is incumbent upon this body in this legislation to put together the means of restoring that confidence. And that confidence only comes back if the justice system can be said to be fair, can be said to be legitimate, and can be said to produce just results. And when it comes to cases of police killing unarmed African Americans, at this point, we do not have those three.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, I did have a question for Mr. Crump and Ms. Gupta, but I'll submit them in writing. I yield back my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Neguse.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Chairman Nadler. Thank you, Chairwoman Bass, members of the committee, and my fellow members of the Congressional Black Caucus for your leadership on this issue. I want to express my deepest condolences to you, Mr. Floyd, and to Ms. Underwood Jacobs as well. I know all of us will continue to keep you and your families in our prayers. What happened to your brother, Mr. Floyd, what happened to Breonna Taylor is truly an outrage. And I pray that together we can meet the moment and we can honor their memories by passing the Justice and Policing Act. And not just to honor their memories, but the memories of so many others across the country. In 2016, here in Colorado, Michael Marshall, a 50-year-old, 112-pound black man, was killed by jail deputies. While enduring a psychiatric episode in jail, he was restrained in the prone position by 5 deputies for over 13 minutes, in which time he aspirated on his own vomit and went in and out of consciousness. And more recently, in August of 2019, Elijah McClain, a 23-year-old unarmed black man, died after a physical encounter with the Aurora Police Department while walking home one night. After initially not responding to police, McClain was tackled to the ground by officers, placed in a chokehold, and vomited. He was later given ketamine, suffered a heart attack on the way to the hospital, and ultimately died. And on the body camera recording, you can clearly hear Elijah say, "I can't breathe." These are the same words that we heard Eric Garner say over 6 years ago as he was put in a chokehold by an NYPD officer. They are the same words spoken by Mr. Floyd, who had a knee to his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. It is past time that Congress banned chokeholds and other harmful police tactics that have led to far too many deaths. And that is why the Justice and Policing Act is so important. And I will say that I'm very encouraged by the broad base of support this legislation has received, including from the American Psychological Association. And with unanimous consent, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask to submit their statement of support into the record.
Without objection.
As you may know, or rather, I know the chairman's well aware, but as many, as I'm sure, are aware also, data on policing has been particularly deficient for quite some time. And as a result, it has hindered our understanding and our ability to hold law enforcement accountable in real time. We don't know this week how many times an officer used a taser or fired their weapon, or how many times individuals were injured while they were in police custody. This is basic information, and it's critical information to ensuring that such actions are regulated. And that brings me to my first question for Ms. Gupta, which is, how does the mostly volunteer system that we currently have on data collection fail to capture these data points? And second, how does requiring state and local law enforcement to report that data improve accountability?
Thank you, Congressman. It is a real shame that in 2020, we still do not have adequate data collection on use of force in this country. We've had to rely for several years on journalists putting this stuff together at the Washington Post and at the Guardian. The FBI has started to try to more systematically collect it, but this bill, the Justice and Policing Act, actually includes a requirement for states to report use of force data to the Justice Department, including the reason that force was used. Technical assistance grants are established in this bill to assist agencies that have fewer than 100 employees with compliance. That was often the reason that police agencies were not reporting on this, but it also requires the Attorney General to collect data on traffic stops, searches, uses of deadly force by federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, and to disaggregate that data by race, ethnicity, and gender. There should be no reason why in the United States of America in 2020 we aren't able to collect that kind of data, and these incentives are going to be really important to making sure that we have that data, can learn from it, and can improve and change the culture of policing from it as well.
Thank you, Ms. Gupta, and your testimony certainly underscores why the Justice and Policing Act is so necessary. Thank you again to each of our witnesses for being here today and for testifying. And with that, I'll yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. McBath.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to thank all of our witnesses that are still left. Thank you for being here for so long today. It's really vitally important that we hear from you. But most specifically, I want to say to you, Mr. Floyd, and also to Ms. Underwood Jacobs, I offer you my deepest condolences, because I know exactly how you feel. I know your pain. I can't sit here and say, I can only imagine. I know what you are going through. And Mr. Floyd, I was so grateful to be able to go to your brother's funeral in Fayetteville, North Carolina. And I am so sorry that you are here testifying over the loss of your brother. We come to this hearing today as a result of deep, morally painful wounds and events that happen in this country again and again and again. We come to remember George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the many lives that have been lost to violence at the hands of those with a sworn duty to protect and serve us. We have lost too many of our brothers and our sisters and our mothers and our fathers under these incidences of law enforcement. We know that these recent tragedies are part of a system of racial disparities that have been harming people of color for 400 years. In Georgia, where I represent Georgia's 6th congressional district, we recently lost the life of Ahmaud Arbery, who was pursued by 3 men and chased by 2 pickup trucks and murdered in the streets just miles from his home. As Georgia investigators testified last week that Ahmaud's killer used the N-word as Ahmaud lay dying in the street. The investigator testified that the killer's father, a former police officer, carried a handgun during the pursuit, a handgun that was issued to him by his police department, a handgun that he carried as a police officer, still bearing the initials of the department. I grieve every day for these continued losses. I grieve as a mother who lost her own child to the very same violence that we're talking about today and tomorrow and next week and next month and next year. I lost my son, Jordan, by a man who called him a thug for simply playing loud music in his car. Jordan's tragedy is shockingly similar to Ahmaud Arbery's. Being black while being in your own community. I feel the pain experienced by too many families every single day, and every single day it happens, it's like a sucker punch in my heart and my gut. Because when is it going to stop? I pray every single day for our nation. I pray every single day for every family. And I pray that today we finally do something about it. I know that my time is going to be up, so I'm going to just ask one very quick question. Professor Butler, very briefly, do you think a commission that I have been working on, a commission that would study the social determinants and the effects of young black men and boys in this country, do you believe that that would be justified in creating research and data for this very legislation that we're talking about today?
I think African-American boys and girls desperately need interventions that don't blame them for problems that society causes. So I think that kind of commission is key.
Thank you very, very much. And I know that my time is up, but I am begging everyone here today, I am begging you to stand in the gap. I am begging you to speak up. I am begging you to be a part of solving the problems of all the young black men and women in this country that die every single day, because if you do not, you are complicit. And now yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Stanton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And thank you for moving quickly to hold this necessary hearing during a time of significant pain for our nation. And I want to recognize and thank Congresswoman Bass for her leadership to heal that pain. The Justice in Policing Act is an essential first step. Mr. Floyd, I offer my deepest condolences to you and your family. I can't imagine how difficult the last 2 weeks have been, and it is courageous that you are here today. Just yesterday, you laid your brother to rest. But his murder is a tragic reminder that we cannot rest. We have work to do so that George Floyd and Eric Garner, Philando Castile, Walter Scott, Antonio Arce, and too many others will not have died in vain, and that their lives spur us to action. It's been more than 400 years since enslaved Africans were first brought to America's shores, shackled and sold. We are in the midst of a reckoning and facing a very difficult truth, that since that moment, there's not been a single day in which the maxim that our founders knew to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, has been fully recognized by our country for Black Americans. Not a single day in which equal justice under the law has been fully experienced by Black Americans. There is no greater tragedy in our history, and our generation has a choice. We can sustain America's original sin, or we can redeem her and be repairers of the breach. I recognize that the ability to end racism in our country is beyond the reach of this committee. We don't have the power to change every person's heart and mind. But what we can do is address structural racism and enact tangible measures of transparency and accountability in policing that can help make everyone safe. This is a charge that every level of government must take up, from those of us in Congress to everyone who serves on a city council. During my time as the mayor of my hometown, we started a community policing trust initiative, which earned the recognition from the Obama administration's Department of Justice. We enhanced de-escalation training for our officers. We rewrote the guidelines for interacting with our immigrant community. We started putting body-worn cameras on officers on patrol. And then when we saw the positive results, we budgeted for every officer on the beat to wear a camera. But I'll be the first to tell you, there is more work to do in every state, in every city, in every community in America. So I want to ask our distinguished panel specifically about body-worn cameras. In 2014, research by Arizona State University found that officers wearing body cameras were more aware of their actions and sensitive to the scrutiny of the footage by their superiors. And I believe that every police officer on patrol in America ought to be wearing a body-worn camera. Professor Butler, do you believe that body-worn cameras help make members of the public and the police officers safer?
Yeah, absolutely. Without body-worn cameras, there would be 4 killer cops who remained on the police force of Minneapolis.
President Davis, how can body-worn cameras improve training for police officers?
Thank you for the question. In addition to capturing what happens, it allows the police department to go back and look at the everyday encounter, car stops, traffic stops, pedestrian stops, and evaluate the kind of conduct. There's a good study out of Oakland, what Stanford did, to show that how officers engage men and women of color is completely different than how they were engaging non-minorities. So there's a lot to be learned just by watching the day-to-day activities, in addition to capturing the critical incidents that we're talking about.
Thank you. Ms. Eiffel, one of the main challenges with body-worn cameras is that they can be expensive to implement, not just the camera itself, but capturing all the information that the cameras provide. In your view, are they a wise and worthwhile investment for law enforcement agencies?
I think body-worn cameras are vitally important, and I would caution that it is necessary to do more than just impose body-worn cameras. And that means there does need to be attention to the laws that govern who gets to look at that film. In jurisdictions where law enforcement officers get to look at the film before they have to answer questions, then the body-worn camera film is just another tool that assists law enforcement officers in the community. I think you also have to pay attention to jurisdictions that are embedding facial recognition technology in their body-worn cameras. This presents a very serious privacy concern for communities, and particularly African-American communities. So they're important. They're not the be-all and end-all, because we've seen film. We saw film with Eric Garner. We saw film with Walter Scott, who the officer who killed Walter Scott, who was originally acquitted, or the jury was hung. We know that film is not the be-all and end-all, but it is vital for all of the reasons that have been suggested. And I do want to flag, however, those cautions about what happens with that film is also a question that I would encourage you all to think about answering on the front end.
Thank you so much. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Chairman Nadler, and thank you, Chairwoman Bass, for bringing us together and for bringing forward this powerful piece of legislation at a time when our country desperately needs it. I thank all of our witnesses today. I pray that our words and our actions will be worthy of this moment. If anybody has a doubt as to systemic racism in this country, as to inequality based on race in this country, you can look no further than between me and my friend and colleague, Ms. McBath. I'm the mother of 3 white sons. I've never had to have the talk. You were the mother of beautiful Jordan Davis. You had to have the talk.
It's 2 hours.
If you doubt there is racism, look no further than the inequality of our life experience. And I mourn with you. My sincere sympathy to Ms. Underwood Jacobs and her family for the loss of her brother. And Mr. Floyd, it is heartbreaking, it is soul-crushing what we witnessed 2.5 weeks ago as the depraved murder of your brother. My sympathy is with you, but more my words and my actions will be with you. The world is watching. Ms. Gupta, I'd like to talk first about the issue of the National Registry. There's been some conversation about it. And I remember the horror of Tamir Rice's murder in 2014, the anger that we all felt, the dismay of a police officer who killed a beautiful little boy. That police officer had been deemed an emotionally unstable and unfit for duty by the police department he had worked at before joining the Cleveland Police. He never disclosed that information in his application. The Cleveland Police never reviewed his previous personnel file before hiring him. We must expect agents of government entrusted with the awesome responsibility of protecting and serving, but also capable of using brutal and deadly force, to be hired under rigorous standards. Do we know how pervasive this problem is of not knowing the background of police officers as they are hired?
There are some registries that associations, regional associations have created, but there is no national registry of this sort that is being proposed in this really important legislation. This is why it is high time that this provision in the Justice and Policing Act be passed. It's time to have a national registry that has this kind of information that could save lives and, frankly, also promote community trust. But this national registry would have misconduct complaints, it would have discipline and termination records, it would have records of certification. It contains conditioning for money, for funds, so that agencies actually have to put in inputs before they can access federal money. But it is high time for this to happen.
I was talking this week with my own Attorney General, Josh Shapiro of Pennsylvania, about the issue of a national registry. He too supports that, but I do know that he has also, as Attorney General, worked with and announced that he wishes to establish and have the legislature in Pennsylvania establish a state registry. I think it's important that my home state is considering that. Should the tracking of disciplinary and performance records of law enforcement be left to the states alone? Is that sufficient, or does it mean that we should do both?
If you just have a patchwork of states that do this, and it's good that states are standing up, because right now is a moment where people are demanding change, and so states are beginning to take action. But you will end up with a patchwork that will not be sufficient to actually achieve the bottom line goal of having a registry that would be national, that people move around. They look at jobs in other jurisdictions. And so it isn't enough to have this patchwork. It's time for Congress to act and to create a national kind of rubric for this.
Absolutely. And Mr. Floyd, I'd like to end with you to thank you for your strength for being here today. We can't imagine the exhaustion, the fatigue, the grief. But we are here with you, and the world supports you. I hope that offers you some consolation. And your brother will be remembered worldwide for a very, very, very long time to come. As your niece and his daughter said, my daddy changed the world, and he has, and I'm confident he will. But I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell us not about his death, but about his life. What did you know and love about your big brother? What should we know about his life?
He was a role model for me and a lot of guys coming out the neighborhood, because he was the first one to get a scholarship. We all wanted scholarships, and he was the first one because it was just hard. You had to get either academic scholarship or you would get one playing sports. But he had got him a scholarship, and it made everybody else feel like they can get one too.
He was a talented athlete.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
I think he was a coach to people, wasn't he?
Yes, ma'am. He was the coach. It's just so much about him. Talking with Cyril, I don't know if y'all know him, but anyway. He talked to a lot of kids. He went to a lot of different places, met a lot of people. He went to China, played with Yao Ming, against Yao Ming. He did a lot of different things, and he come back and he share information with us, and it was excited to see him every time because he showed us so much, just a big gentle giant. And he took us to a lot of places. We went to Orlando, went down there and watched the basketball games. He had a lot of friends as athletes, and we just vibed, and he showed us that there's other places in life besides being in the neighborhood.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Floyd. I see my time has expired.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. I want to start my 5 minutes with a video that I came across, and it really struck a chord. This happened in Miami. The women in the video were worried. They had been threatened by a neighbor who had a shotgun and was making racist slurs. They called 911 for safety and for protection. Instead, they were met with force.
I have to be corrected when my life was just threatened and my daughter's sick. I just want to go to the store and charge my phone.
Please stop. She didn't even do nothing.
Touch me. Do not touch me. Do not touch me.
What
do
the
not
heck?
record this.
I
Do not
am.
touch me.
What the? Why are you doing that? Why are you doing that?
Do not touch
Why are you
me.
doing
Do
that?
not touch me.
She's
I
not
just
doing
said
nothing.
I wanted to call my kids. I just said I wanted to call my kids. My phone is dead. What do you not understand? I got a gun pointed in front of me, and my kids is sick. I'm stressed out. I need to go call my children.
Conduct like this is never acceptable. The woman was unarmed. She called 911 because she felt threatened. She called 911 hoping that police officers would come to protect her. And instead, you saw those images. The officer in this video later lied about what happened on the police report and is now facing charges of misconduct and battery. Let me tell you, this happened only 2 months ago. There was no reason to subject someone to excessive force because of the color of their skin. And the reality is that people of color live and face these prejudices throughout their entire lives. They face discrimination. It's ingrained in our culture since the very founding of our country. And we have to confront this crisis head on. Currently, right now, there is absolutely no national standard to require police officers to de-escalate and avoid the use of excessive force. We have to eliminate the injustices that Black men and women and communities of color face everywhere, in our government, in our society, in our healthcare system, and specifically in the police systems that we have seen for decades. I can also tell you that from my own personal experience, this is not representative of every police officer. I have very close relationships with law enforcement in Miami. Officer Tooks, McCombie, Officer Demps, they are part of the community. They have earned the trust of the community. But we have to start by accepting that there is racial bias in our police system. We have to accept that. I continue to hear from members of this administration that there's no racism, that there's no racial bias. And that is not true. Racism is systemic, and we have to hold our police departments accountable and demand transparency. To do that, we have to engage with the community through civilian oversight. Civilian oversight boards build bridges between police and communities by giving the people a voice in the policies that affect them. They ensure officer accountability through fair and open investigation, and over time, they build trust. Civilian oversight has to be done correctly, however. They have to be independent, they have to have subpoena power, they must have the authority to conduct investigations into police misconduct, and most importantly, civilian oversight boards have to represent the diversity in the community. Its seats need to be filled not by political appointees, but with local citizens and the leaders of local organizations focused on community policing and accountability. So I'm proud that the Justice and Policing Act promotes civilian oversight and allows federal funding to go toward building civilian review boards. So my first question is to Mr. Ron Davis. I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in your testimony the need for police to collaborate with the community to redefine and reimagine policing. And that includes a new system that fosters civilian oversight. Can you please explain why civilian oversight is an important factor in preventing police brutality and is effective in holding police accountable?
Yes, Congresswoman, and thank you for the call. I'll refer back to, I think as one of your colleagues mentioned, Sir Robert Peel, the 10 principles, or some called the 9 principles of law enforcement. And one of them says that police only police or use their authority with the consent of people. And the best way to have the consent is you need the checks and balances to make sure that those, for our police officers, myself included when I was serving, to have such enormous and awesome power, the power to take freedom, the power to take life, are held accountable with a check and balance system so that there is trust, that there's legitimacy, and that there's accountability. So civilian oversight provides that extra layer, the same way we want independent prosecutors, independent investigations of all shootings. To have an independent civilian oversight body is a checks and balance so that the awesome power that the police are given by the community is accountable. We're accountable for that, and that we then police with the consent of the people, and that's the only way we can be effective. So there are varying models with it, but I think in general, the core principle of civilian oversight does go towards community policing. It makes the police and the community producers of public safety, both responsible, both being accountable, and it's the best form of oversight that you can have.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. And Mr. Floyd, thank you so much for joining us today. Losing someone in a violent manner and having footage of that has to be the most devastating way of losing someone. So I share with all my colleagues here today my deepest condolences to you and the family, and we're here for anything that you need. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. Mr. Cicilline.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of the witnesses who have appeared today. I, too, extend my condolences to Ms. Underwood Jacobs on the loss of her brother, and to you, Mr. Floyd, on the loss of your brother, and will continue to keep you and your family in my thoughts and prayers. I hope you recognize, Mr. Floyd, that the brutal murder of your brother has awakened the conscience of this country. And it has resulted in people all across America raising their voices and demanding an end to racial injustice, an end to police brutality, particularly against Black Americans and other communities of color, and for the creation of a safe, effective policing model for every single person in this country that will improve public safety and also the safety and effectiveness of police work. The tragedy is these are not new problems that we're experiencing. Your brother's death is only the most recent example of ugly racism and police brutality that have been a stain on the soul of this nation since our founding. I think everyone in this hearing brings their own experiences. And so before I was in politics, I was a civil rights lawyer, and most of my cases were police brutality cases. And so many of the hurdles that I've faced in bringing those cases and seeking justice are addressed in the Justice and Policing Act. I then became mayor of the city of Providence and inherited a police department that was under a patterns of practice investigation by the Department of Justice. A police department that was really at war with the community. Crime was on the increase and the public had lost confidence in that community. And one of the things that was so effective in turning around that was the participation of the community and working in partnership with the police. We produced the lowest crime rate in 40 years. We became a fully accredited police department, and the police officers became integrated into the communities they served. And so one of the things that I'm really concerned about is during the Trump administration, has changed the policies about these patterns and practice investigations. It was one of the things that we were able to use to force change that the chief and the department and I as the mayor wanted. Under the Obama administration, the Justice Department opened 25 investigations into police departments, signed and enforced over a dozen consent decrees in places as diverse as Ferguson, Seattle, New Orleans, and had several open investigations. And the Trump administration then came in and really changed positions on that. And I know, Ms. Gupta, you're familiar with that. What has been the impact of the decision of the Trump administration not to pursue patterns and practice investigations? And this legislation not only strengthens the ability of DOJ to do that, but also gives that responsibility to state attorneys general. Can you speak a little bit about why that's necessary and why this is such a powerful mechanism for changing police departments and reforming police departments?
Yeah, the Trump DOJ has essentially abandoned and abdicated a mandate that was given by Congress in 1994 to investigate patterns and practices of systemic unconstitutional policing in police departments around the country. Since the administration began, there has been the opening only of one on a very tiny issue at a police department out of Springfield, Massachusetts, compared to 25 in the Obama administration and many others in Republican and Democratic administrations prior to that. And so what that has meant is that the tool of these investigations, the tool of the consent decrees, has just been lying dormant. Typically, when I oversaw the Civil Rights Division, we had mayors and police chiefs that really, in numerous instances, were actually asking the Justice Department to come in because they needed federal help in very bad situations. And so jurisdictions have not been able to rely anymore on the Justice Department to support these kinds of efforts. And I think this bill, Justice and Policing, does a lot to strengthen the Civil Rights Division's authority, giving it subpoena power, giving it resources. It also gives state attorneys general the ability to do these pattern and practices where they have already state laws that allow them to do it as well. And that's, of course, in this moment, with a Justice Department that is very disengaged from these issues, an important thing.
Thank you. And Professor Butler, very quickly, because I don't have a little time left. I'm also very interested in the accreditation model because I think that's a way to help transform the police departments all across the country quickly. And I'm wondering whether or not you have a view as to whether or not the provisions that provide for training to end racial bias and to end racial profiling, whether there are really high-quality components of an accreditation system that can really effect systematic change.
I think they're essential. We've gotten away from being tough on crime. We're now about being smart on crime. It's evidence-based practices. The evidence suggests that police can do better with appropriate training.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent request. I ask unanimous consent that an article entitled, "It's Official, the Trump Administration Will Pull Back from Investigating Police Abuses" be made part of the record.
Without objection.
Another article entitled, "The Trump Administration Gave Up on Federal Oversight of Police Agencies Just as It Was Starting to Work."
Without objection.
And a final article entitled, "Trump and Session Released Cops from Federal Oversight. Now we see the results."
Without objection.
And with that, Mr. Chairman, I just want to end where I began, with deep gratitude to Mr. Floyd for the courage and the grace that you have shown and for being such an inspiration to us. And I only pray and hope that my colleagues in the Congress of the United States will have the same courage and will be inspired to do the right thing and to respond in this historic way to really change the way communities and police relate, and that will all be done to honor the life and legacy of your brother. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Without objection, the following materials concerning the Justice and Policing Act and related issues, which have been submitted to the committee's electronic repository, will be included in the record. A number of leading civil rights organizations, statements by the Fraternal Order of Police, the Constitutional Accountability Center, the Players Coalition, the YWCA, Adobe, Third Way, the National Partnership for Women and Families, the Blue Dog Coalition, and articles in Reuters and Boston Globe will be admitted into the record without objection. I want to thank our witnesses for participating in today's hearing, in particular Mr. Floyd, with whom we have the greatest sympathy and thanks. That concludes today's hearing. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. Without objection, the hearing is adjourned.